I went to the bank unannounced and caught my daughter-in-law declaring me mentally unfit. That is not a sentence I ever imagined would come out of my mouth, but it is the truth, and it marked the most shocking betrayal of my life. For decades, I carried myself as a man of dignity, a man of sacrifice, a man who believed that loyalty and family meant more than gold. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Yet in that sterile bank office, hidden behind glass partitions and the smell of freshly printed documents, I overheard my own daughter-in-law conspiring to strip me of everything I had worked for. She sat there with her confident smile, her manicured hands resting on the desk, speaking to the bank officer as though my years of labor and sacrifice were nothing but disposable currency. Her words cut into me deeper than a knife because they were not just lies, they were betrayals spoken by someone I had welcomed into my home, someone I trusted with the very blood of my family. I did not plan to go to the bank that morning. I had a small check to deposit, nothing of great consequence, and I thought I would quietly slip in and out unnoticed. Fate, it seems, had other plans. As I stepped into the bank, the low murmur of voices and the clicking of keyboards filled the air. My eyes swept across the counters, searching for an open teller, when I heard it, my name, not spoken in respect or affection, but wielded like a weapon. My feet froze, my pulse quickened, and without even meaning to, I drifted closer to the sound. There she was, my daughter-in-law, the woman I had helped when she first joined this family, the woman for whom I had opened my home and my wallet countless times. She was seated across from a banker, her posture straight, her voice calm, but her words dripping with venom. She was declaring me unfit, mentally incapable of handling my own finances, trying to convince the institution that the man who had built a life with his bare hands was no longer capable of making decisions. In that moment, I realized that all my sacrifices, all the nights of broken sleep and long hours of toil, had led me to this betrayal. Do you know what it feels like to hear your own flesh and blood by marriage plot your downfall? To watch someone who has smiled at your table, eaten your food, and accepted your generosity, now paint you as a fool unworthy of trust? It is a hollowness that spreads from your chest to your bones. My hand trembled against the counter, my throat dried, I could barely breathe. I wanted to storm in, to shout, to remind her who I was, but I did not. I stood there in silence, listening, absorbing every poisonous word. That was the moment my life changed forever. I did not yet know how, but I knew this. She had underestimated me. She thought I was too old, too slow, too tired to fight back. She thought she could erase my dignity with a few signatures. But she was wrong. Very wrong. My name does not matter as much as the years that shaped me. I am a man in my late 60s, retired now, though I hesitate to even call it retirement. For most of my life, I never knew rest. I knew only labor, persistence, and sacrifice. I was widowed far too soon, and when my wife passed, I made a vow over her grave that I would give our son a life where he would never have to feel the crushing weight of want that I had carried since my youth. That promise became the heartbeat of my existence. Every decision guided by it, every ounce of my strength poured into it. I was not born into privilege. Every penny I earned was soaked in sweat. I worked jobs that most people avoided. Long hours at the factory, early mornings doing deliveries, weekends repairing machines just to scrape together enough to pay bills. My hands grew calloused, my back bent, but I never once faltered. I lived frugally, ate modestly, and saved with relentless discipline. Others spent on pleasures and fleeting comforts. I saved for a future I would never live to see, but one I wanted my son to inherit. My philosophy was simple. What I endured, he would not. The home I built was not extravagant, but it was secure. I remember the early years, patching leaks in the roof with my own hands, painting walls with brushes that shed more bristles than paint, and repairing broken furniture instead of buying new. Every crack, every repair, carried my fingerprints, symbols of devotion to the stability of my family. And though the house was modest, it was filled with warmth and love when my wife was alive. We used to sit at the kitchen table late at night after my shifts, drinking tea while she reminded me why the struggle mattered. She believed in me, and in that belief, I found strength. After she passed, the house grew quieter, emptier, but my purpose remained. My son became the center of my universe. I made sure he had good schooling, proper meals, clothes that fit him well. I sacrificed my desires, postponing every comfort for myself. No vacations, no luxuries, no indulgences. While my peers celebrated promotions with new cars or built vacation houses, I quietly built savings accounts, investments, and bonds. Each deposit I made was not for me. It was for him. I wanted him to step into adulthood with a foundation stronger than mine had ever been. People sometimes called me frugal, even stingy. They could not see that my thrift was an act of love. They did not know how it felt to sit at a dinner table across from a child who depended on you for everything. I endured loneliness, exhaustion, even humiliation at times, but I endured it gladly because I knew my sacrifices bought him security. I thought I had done right by him. I believed that by handing him stability, I had secured not just his future, but his gratitude. I assumed my devotion would be remembered, even honored. That belief kept me moving forward through the long years of work. But as I would later discover, gratitude does not always grow where seeds of sacrifice are planted. Sometimes it is replaced by greed, entitlement, and betrayal. If I am to tell this story truthfully, then I must introduce her, the woman who would become my greatest source of betrayal, my daughter-in-law. From the very beginning, there was something in her presence that unsettled me, though I brushed it aside at first. She was young, vibrant, and carried herself with a confidence that some might mistake for charm, but beneath that polished surface lay an arrogance that grew clearer with each passing year. When she first entered our family, I welcomed her with open arms because I believed that was my duty. She was the woman my son loved, and for his sake, I embraced her as my own. I told myself that the unease I felt was nothing more than the awkwardness of new family dynamics. But over time, her mask began to slip. She was obsessed with appearances. Her conversations always drifted toward money, possessions, or the lives of others who she deemed more successful. I remember her boasting at dinners about acquaintances who had bigger houses, fancier cars, and more extravagant vacations. Her eyes would gleam not when speaking of kindness or loyalty, but when discussing wealth and status. It became clear that in her eyes, people were valued not by their character, but by the size of their bank accounts. To her, I was not a father figure. I was not even a human being with a lifetime of sacrifice behind me. I was an obstacle. She saw me as the old man standing between her and the fortune she believed she deserved. My years of hard work, my savings, my modest investments, they were not symbols of security for the family. They were prizes she lusted after. She would smile at me across the dinner table, but in her smile I began to see calculation. Every word she spoke dripped with a subtle dismissal. as though reminding me that I was old, outdated, and irrelevant in the world she wanted to dominate. There were moments when she could not even hide her contempt. If I spoke of the value of saving, she would laugh softly under her breath and mutter about how times have changed. If I offered advice born from decades of endurance, she would dismiss it with a wave of her hand, as though I were a child rambling nonsense. I began to feel invisible in my own home, my voice drowned out by her ambition. She had my son wrapped around her finger, his silence becoming her greatest weapon. The most dangerous kind of ingratitude is the kind that hides beneath politeness. That was her specialty. To outsiders, she appeared dutiful, even respectful. She played the role of the devoted wife and daughter-in-law perfectly. But behind closed doors, in the subtle shift of her eyes, in the way her tone hardened when she thought I was not listening, I saw the truth. She wanted control, complete control, and she believed the first step was erasing me, or at least stripping me of authority. I gave her the benefit of the doubt far too long. I told myself she would grow into gratitude, that her fixation on wealth was nothing more than youthful folly. I wanted to believe that the love of my son would anchor her. But I was wrong. Her hunger for power was not a phase. It was the core of her being. And eventually, that hunger would turn on me with a cruelty I never imagined possible. Family is supposed to be sacred. That was always my belief, and it was the foundation of the way I lived my life. When my son brought his future wife home for the first time, I opened my heart to her without hesitation. I thought of my late wife and how proud she would have been to see our son finding someone to share his life with. I told myself that it was my duty and my joy to welcome this woman as part of us. I even remember the first dinner we shared together, how I set the table with my wife's old china, the pieces she had loved so dearly, because I wanted to show this young woman that she was not just a guest, but family. I looked her in the eyes that night and told her, "You are one of us now." At the time, I meant it with every fiber of my being. I offered her the same kindness I would have given a daughter if life had granted me one. I tried to help ease her into our home. I offered advice. I supported her when she and my son were struggling with bills early in their marriage. There were moments I even dipped into my savings to help them start fresh, because I believed that is what a father does. I never thought twice about it. Every coin, every bill I had earned was meant to build security, not only for my son but for the family he would build. And so, in my mind, helping her was simply an extension of the promise I had made to my wife and to my son, that I would provide no matter the cost. At family gatherings, I tried to see the good in her. I overlooked the sharpness in her tone, the way she sometimes dismissed my words. I told myself that she was adjusting, that she was young, and that patience would bridge whatever distance I felt between us. I gave her the benefit of the doubt again and again because I believed in the power of family. I believed that if I kept showing her love and respect, she would eventually understand that I saw her as more than just my son's wife. I saw her as my daughter. But as the years went on, the truth became harder to ignore. I started to notice how her kindness only surfaced when she wanted something. A warm smile, a polite word, a gesture of respect. These were not born of genuine affection, but of convenience. She knew how to play the part of the dutiful daughter-in-law when eyes were watching, but in private, her mask would slip. A cold glance, a dismissive tone, a calculated silence. It was in those moments I realized that she did not see me as family. She saw me as a resource, an obstacle, a man with accounts she believed she had the right to claim. What pains me most is not her greed itself, but my blindness to it. I had placed so much trust in her. I wanted so badly to believe that love and loyalty were enough to bind us together. I believed that opening my home and my heart was enough to prove my sincerity. But instead of gratitude, what I received was calculation. She never truly saw me, not as a father, not as a protector, not as a human being who had lived and bled for this family. To her, I was nothing more than a wallet with a heartbeat. It is a bitter thing to discover that the family you thought you had is nothing more than an illusion. It shakes you to your very core. For me, the realization was slow at first, creeping in during small moments of silence. But when I overheard her at that bank, conspiring against me, every suspicion I had ever buried came rushing to the surface. She had played her part well, but the truth was undeniable now. She was never truly mine to call family. She was a stranger cloaked in entitlement, sitting at my table, waiting for the day she could strip me of everything. If there was one thing that pained me as much as her betrayal, it was my son's silence. A father never stops believing that his child will one day rise to meet his hopes. I had poured every drop of my life into him. I raised him with discipline, yes, but also with compassion. I taught him to be honest, to respect others, and above all, to stand for what is right. Yet when he married her, something in him began to shift. It was as though the boy I had raised, the boy who once ran to me for advice and held my words as gospel, slowly faded into a shadow. What remained was a man too timid to challenge the woman who ruled his household with a soft but iron hand. At first, I thought it was simply the natural give and take of marriage. After all, every couple has to navigate compromise. I expected disagreements. I expected changes in priorities, but I never expected his silence to harden into a kind of submission. I watched the way he looked at her when she spoke, never interrupting, never correcting, as though his voice had been taken from him. When she dismissed my words, he would lower his eyes. When she made decisions that affected us all, he would nod along, as if he had no opinion of his own. I wanted to shake him, to remind him of who he was. This was the boy who used to stand up to bullies at school, the one who once told me proudly that he would never let anyone trample over his family's name. I had believed him. I had trusted that courage would grow with him into manhood. But instead, I saw him shrink. I saw him become smaller in his own home, a man who deferred everything to the whims of his wife. Do not misunderstand me. I did not want him to disrespect her. Marriage requires respect and unity. But unity should not mean erasing yourself. Loyalty to a wife should not mean betraying your father. Yet time and again, when she spoke against me, when she undermined me, when she made sly remarks meant to belittle me, my son stood silent. His silence screamed louder than any words. It told me he was too afraid to confront her. It told me he valued peace with her more than justice for me. Sometimes I would catch his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the boy. I remembered the one who wanted to defend me, the one who wanted to speak. But just as quickly, it would vanish, replaced by hesitation, by fear, by resignation. I wondered what she had said to him behind closed doors, what power she held over him to make him abandon his own voice. Perhaps he thought silence was protection. Perhaps he convinced himself that by saying nothing, he was avoiding conflict. But what he failed to understand was that silence is its own form of betrayal. To remain neutral in the face of injustice is to side with the oppressor. And though I loved him, though I could never stop loving him, I could not deny the truth. My son's weakness became her greatest weapon. It is a terrible thing for a father to admit, but I no longer recognized the man my son had become. He had allowed her ambition to eclipse his judgment. He had allowed her voice to replace his own. And in doing so, he had left me exposed, unprotected, standing alone against the storm she was preparing. I told myself he was not malicious, that he did not wish me harm, but in his unwillingness to challenge her, he became complicit in her schemes. A son's silence, I realized, can cut as deeply as a stranger's betrayal. And in my quiet moments, I wondered which wound hurt more, the cruelty of my daughter-in-law or the weakness of my son. It was an ordinary morning, the kind of morning that should have passed without consequence. I had a small check to deposit, nothing of great importance, but I decided to stop by the bank on my way back from the market. It was an unplanned visit, unannounced, just a routine errand to keep my finances in order. Little did I know that this simple decision would unravel the truth of everything I had feared. The bank was quiet when I entered, its walls lined with promotional posters promising financial security and wealth management. The air smelled faintly of printer ink and polished floors. A few customers waited in line, tapping their feet impatiently, while others sat with clipboards filling out forms. I held my check in my hand, already rehearsing the brief interaction I expected with the teller. But then, as I stepped further inside, I heard something that froze me in my tracks. My name, spoken clearly. It was not said with respect. It was not said with affection. It was uttered like a problem, an inconvenience, a barrier to be removed. My ears sharpened, my body went still, and instinct pulled me toward the sound. The voices were coming from one of the small consultation offices tucked away behind the glass panels. I moved closer, my footsteps soft against the floor. Through the slightly open door, I saw her, my daughter-in-law. She sat across from a bank officer, her posture confident, her tone measured, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had already won. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. She was calmly explaining that I was no longer capable of handling my finances. Her words dripped with feigned concern, the kind that would fool anyone who did not know her true nature. She spoke about my age, how forgetful I was, how confused I had become. Lies, all lies. She was painting me as a man slipping into incompetence, a man unfit to manage his own money. Her voice never faltered, steady and persuasive, as though she had rehearsed it countless times. The bank officer leaned forward, nodding politely, jotting down notes as though her fabrications carried weight. My heart pounded in my chest, anger mixing with disbelief. For a moment, I wondered if I had misheard, if my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard her say it plainly. She wanted control of my accounts, authority over my finances, the legal power to manage everything I had worked for. My hand trembled against the counter beside me. I felt the check nearly slip from my grip. A rush of memories flooded me in that instant, decades of long hours, of sacrifices, of careful saving, all of it meant for my son and his family. And now, here was the woman I had accepted into my home, the woman I had trusted, trying to strip it all away with a few signatures and a performance of false concern. I should have stormed in, confronted her, shouted the truth into the room. Every part of me wanted to expose her in that moment, but something in me held back. I remained in the shadows, silent, listening to every venomous word she spoke, because, as painful as it was to hear, I knew this was evidence. I knew this was the mask falling away completely. She was showing her true self, and I needed to see it all. So I stood there, breathing shallowly, absorbing the betrayal that dripped from her tongue. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment I realized I was no longer dealing with family. I was facing an enemy. My hands trembled as I pressed them against the cool surface of the counter, trying to steady myself, but the strength seemed to drain out of me all at once. My fingers quivered, my chest tightened, and it felt as though the very air had grown heavy in my lungs. I had spent my life building something solid out of nothing but sweat and sacrifice, and in that sterile office, I listened to it being dismantled by words that dripped with calculated deceit. Betrayal does not always come with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes in the calm, practiced tones of someone who has already rehearsed your destruction. As I stood there in silence, memories began to flash before me in rapid succession, like shards of glass cutting into my heart. I remembered the first time I welcomed her into my home, how I told myself she was family, how I gave her the benefit of the doubt despite the unease that stirred within me. I remembered the nights I stayed up late, working double shifts to build savings that were never meant for me, but for my son and the family he would one day create. I remembered the countless times I had dipped into those savings to help them pay bills, cover medical expenses, or buy things they said they needed urgently. Every sacrifice came back to me now, not as a source of pride, but as a knife twisted deeper with every word she spoke. Her voice carried on, cold and steady, as she told the banker that I was forgetful, confused, incapable of managing my affairs. Each word was a hammer striking against the years of dignity I had tried so hard to preserve. She spoke as though I were already gone, as though my mind had rotted away, leaving nothing but a frail body with a bank account waiting to be claimed. The gall of it, the cruelty of it, left me staggering under the weight of disbelief. How could she? How could the woman I had treated as my own, the one I had supported in every way I could, reduce me to nothing more than a feeble old man in the eyes of strangers? I thought of my wife, long gone, and I felt a surge of sorrow at the thought of what she would have said if she could see this moment. She had trusted me to protect our son, to preserve the family we had built together, and here was the woman our son had chosen, dismantling that trust with a smile on her face. I wanted to shout. I wanted to burst into that office and remind her who I was. Remind her that I was not weak, not incompetent, not some helpless relic to be brushed aside. But I stayed still, my body trembling, my jaw clenched so tightly I thought my teeth would crack. Because even in that moment of searing pain, a part of me knew that silence was power. If I revealed myself too soon, she would cover her tracks. She would retreat into innocence, deny her words, paint herself as the victim. No, I told myself. I needed to hear it all. I needed the full weight of her betrayal to carve itself into my memory, because that memory would become my weapon. As I listened, the years of sacrifice became clearer than ever. Every ache in my back, every scar on my hands, every hour I had given up so that my son and his family would have more, it all seemed to burn in my chest. And to realize that she now plotted to strip me of the very fruits of that labor was a cruelty I could scarcely put into words. My world tilted on its axis in that moment, and I knew there was no going back. The trust I had given her was gone, shattered beyond repair. It is one thing to face adversity from strangers, but when the knife comes from inside your own home, the wound cuts deeper. That day, in that bank, I felt the sharp edge of betrayal pierce my soul. And as my hands trembled, one truth crystallized in my mind. She had declared war on me, and she did not even know it yet. When the last of her venomous words reached my ears, I felt the heat of rage boiling in my chest, a fire that demanded release. Every instinct screamed at me to burst into that office, to rip the mask off her smug face and expose her lies in front of the banker who sat nodding like an eager accomplice. My jaw clenched until it ached, and I could feel the pulse of my anger in the tips of my trembling fingers. But I did not move. Not yet. I forced myself to stand perfectly still, to breathe shallow and quiet, to swallow the storm that raged inside me. For I realized in that moment that anger alone would not win this battle. Patience would. I turned away from the glass office, each step heavy, deliberate. My shoes clicked against the polished floor as I made my way to the exit, but I walked with the stillness of a man in mourning. I clutched my small check tightly in my hand, the paper now crumpled and damp with the sweat of my fury. People around me carried on as though nothing had happened, as though the world had not just shifted beneath my feet. A teller smiled politely at me as I passed, unaware that I had just witnessed my daughter-in-law attempt to bury me alive with lies. As I pushed open the glass door and stepped into the sharp daylight, the cool air hit my face, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. But the breath came ragged, filled with restraint. The sun shone down on the city as though mocking me, as though unaware that I had just seen the mask torn from the face of someone I once trusted. I stopped at the sidewalk, my hands trembling by my sides, and I knew I had a choice. Confront her now in a blaze of fury, or walk away in silence and plan. I chose silence. It was the hardest decision I had ever made. My pride wanted vindication in that very moment, to march back inside, call her by name, and watch her face pale as she realized her plot had been discovered. But pride is fleeting, and battles won in haste are often lost in the end. No, I told myself, she must never know I was there. She must never know that her lies had reached my ears. Because in her arrogance, she believed herself untouchable. She believed me blind and weak. And if I let her go on believing that, she would make mistakes. Mistakes I could use to destroy her. I walked away from the bank that day with my head lowered, the fury contained like a caged beast within me. Every step I took felt like a test of will, a demand to hold back the storm until the time was right. I passed familiar streets, shop windows reflecting a man who looked older, heavier, but whose eyes glinted with a quiet, cold fire. I realized then that my silence was not weakness. It was my first act of power. She thought I would never know. She thought her words would vanish behind office doors, safe and unchallenged. But I carried them now, etched into my memory, every syllable carved like stone. And though she believed she had already begun to erase me, she had in fact awakened something I had buried for years, the resolve to fight, the clarity to strike, and the patience to wait until her downfall would be undeniable. I left the bank that day with nothing but a crumpled check and a heart full of rage. But I also carried something greater, the seed of a plan. She had no idea that I was there, no idea that the man she plotted against walked quietly past her, concealing his fury behind a mask of calm, and that ignorance would be her undoing. As I walked away from the bank that day, my silence pressing down on me like a heavy cloak, my mind would not allow me peace. Instead, it dragged me backward into the past, into all the moments when I had shown her kindness, when I had extended a hand she did not deserve. Each memory rose up sharp and bitter, mocking me now, because what had once been acts of love and generosity had been twisted into weapons she used against me. I remembered the day my son first confessed that they were drowning in debt. He had called me late at night, his voice tight with shame, his words hesitant as though he feared I would scold him. But I did not scold. I told him to come over, and when he arrived, she was with him, her eyes swollen from crying. I did not ask how they had gotten into such a state. I did not question their choices. Instead, I went to the small drawer in my desk, pulled out the envelope of cash I had been saving, and handed it to them. It was money I had set aside for repairs to the house, money I had meant to use to fix the leaking roof. But when I saw her tears, I thought only of family. I thought that by easing their burden, I was building trust, securing loyalty. She had thanked me that night, even hugged me, but now I wondered if even that gratitude had been rehearsed. Another memory surfaced, one that once brought me pride but now filled me with a hollow ache. When she was carrying my grandchild, I had gone out of my way to make her comfortable. I remember staying up late to prepare the nursery, painting the walls with my own hands, assembling the crib piece by piece. I drove them to doctor's appointments when my son was too busy with work. I ran errands so she would not have to strain herself. I told myself that she was fragile, that she needed support, and I was glad to give it. I even paid hospital bills when the insurance did not cover everything, quietly writing the checks and telling her not to worry. She had smiled at me then, that same soft smile that now felt like nothing more than a mask hiding her ambition. And then there were the smaller moments, the countless gestures that chipped away at my savings, but that I had given freely. Groceries delivered to their doorstep when money was tight, utility bills covered when they were falling behind. Gifts slipped into their hands during holidays, not out of obligation but out of love. Each time I told myself that this was what family meant, that love was proven not in words, but in sacrifices made quietly, without expectation of return. But now, standing in the aftermath of what I had overheard, those memories burned. Each one was a reminder that I had been blind, that I had mistaken convenience for affection. She had taken every kindness, pocketed every sacrifice, and instead of gratitude, she had grown entitlement. My generosity had not softened her heart. It had only convinced her that I was nothing but a resource, a man who would give and give until nothing was left. I clenched my fists as the truth settled over me like a shroud. I had once believed those memories were proof of love. Now I saw them for what they were, proof of how far I had allowed myself to be exploited. What I had thought were acts of devotion had been twisted into stepping stones for her ambition. She had never seen me as a father. She had never seen me as family. She had only ever seen me as an obstacle standing between her and the wealth she thought she deserved. And that realization, painful as it was, hardened something inside me. If my kindness had only fueled her ingratitude, then it was time to show her the strength that kindness had concealed all along. The days following that encounter at the bank were unlike any I had known before. At first, the weight of what I had heard pressed down on me with suffocating heaviness. I felt it in the quiet of my house, in the echo of my footsteps across the old wooden floors, in the silence that once had been a comfort but now seemed to mock me. The betrayal burned in my chest, and there were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart aching with the thought that the woman I had embraced as family was scheming to erase me as though I were nothing more than a piece of paper to be signed away. But something began to change. The grief did not vanish, but it hardened, transforming into something far more powerful. Pain became steel, and sorrow became fuel. As the days stretched on, my trembling hands steadied, and my weary heart found a rhythm of resolve. Rage had once threatened to consume me, but now it sharpened into clarity. I understood one thing with absolute certainty. She would never lay a finger on what I had built. No matter how cunning she thought she was, no matter how carefully she planned, she would not succeed. I began to think back over my life, over all the years of sacrifice that had led me here. The countless hours of labor, the coins and bills carefully saved, the investments made not for indulgence but for stability. They were not hers to claim. They were mine. They were my legacy. They were the proof of a life spent enduring and overcoming. And I refused to allow them to fall into the greedy hands of someone who saw me as nothing more than a decaying obstacle in her path. I vowed to myself, silently but with unshakable determination, that she would fail. She would underestimate me, as she always had. She would continue to believe that age had softened my mind, that my silence meant weakness. Let her think that. Let her build her illusions of power and control. For while she wove her schemes in secret, I would weave something stronger. The fire inside me grew each time I replayed her words in my mind. Each false claim about my confusion, each fabricated weakness, became a nail in the coffin of her own ambitions. She thought she could strip me of dignity with her lies, but all she had done was awaken a part of me I had buried, the part that remembered how to fight, how to endure, how to stand unyielding in the face of storms. There is a moment in every man's life when pain transforms into power, when betrayal ceases to wound and instead becomes the very foundation for strength. I had reached that moment. No longer would I pace the floors of my house in sorrow. No longer would I feel the tremor of helplessness in my hands. I was resolute. My money, my legacy, my dignity would remain untouched. And I whispered into the stillness of my home, as though speaking it aloud would etch it into stone. She will never win. She will never take what is mine. The very next step was clear to me. If she wanted to play her games with lies and signatures, then I would answer her with the truth sealed in iron and law. Rage alone would not be enough. Words would not protect me. I needed the kind of armor that no manipulation, no scheme, and no poisonous smile could pierce. And so I turned to a weapon she would never expect, the law itself. It was not easy for me. I had never been the kind of man to sit across from lawyers or financial advisors. My life had been built with my own two hands, brick by brick, penny by penny. But now, at my age, I knew that if I did not place my trust in the right professionals, everything I had worked for would become vulnerable to her greed. And so, with a folder of documents clutched under my arm and a heavy heart, I made my way into a lawyer's office. The man who greeted me was younger than I expected, but his eyes were sharp and his voice steady. His office smelled faintly of leather and ink, the walls lined with thick books that promised knowledge of battles fought in paper and law. He listened carefully as I laid out the situation, my voice low but firm, recounting the words I had overheard at the bank. He did not interrupt. He did not scoff or dismiss my fears. When I finished, he leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk, and he told me exactly what I needed to hear. "You are not powerless. There are ways to protect yourself," he explained, step by step, how to safeguard my estate. He told me about restructuring my finances, transferring certain assets into trusts that bypassed the greedy hands of anyone who might try to claim them. He spoke of updating wills, of naming beneficiaries who could not be contested, of creating barriers that even the most determined manipulator would not be able to breach. Every word felt like a shield being forged before my eyes. Each document he described a wall raised higher and stronger around my life's work. We discussed my accounts, my property, even the smallest investments I had made over the years. He pointed out vulnerabilities I had never considered, loopholes she might have tried to exploit, and together we closed them, one by one. By the time he was done explaining, I realized something that sent a surge of strength through me. She had underestimated me, but she had also underestimated the law. I signed papers that day that carried more weight than any word she could ever speak. With each signature, I felt my resolve tighten. These were not just documents. They were promises to myself. Promises that my sacrifices would not be stolen, that my dignity would not be erased. The lawyer assured me that as long as these protections were in place, no false claim of incompetence could ever strip me of control. As I left his office, the sun hung lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. But for the first time in days, my heart felt lighter. I walked with steadier steps, clutching the folder of documents to my chest. It was more than paper. It was a shield, a declaration that I was not defeated, that my life's work was mine to protect. She thought her words would be enough to dismantle me, but I had found my answer. She would never see it coming. Once the lawyer laid out the roadmap, I knew exactly what needed to be done, and I carried out each step with the kind of quiet precision that only a man betrayed could muster. She believed I would never notice her schemes. She believed I was blind, fragile, unfit to defend myself. What she did not realize was that betrayal has a way of sharpening the mind, of turning every small act into a blade honed against the enemy. So I began my secret plan, hidden in silence, moving carefully so she would never suspect until it was far too late. The first step was the most important, transferring my funds. With my lawyer's guidance, I moved accounts that she thought she would inherit one day into structures she could not touch. Some went into trusts, carefully crafted with conditions that ensured only those I truly loved would ever benefit. My grandchildren, innocent, pure, untouched by her greed, became the primary heirs. Others went into secure holdings under my name, protected by clauses that would keep them shielded from manipulation. Every transfer I made felt like reclaiming a piece of my dignity, like slamming a door in her face without her even realizing it. Next came the will. For years, it had sat in my desk drawer, outdated but written with the assumption that family meant loyalty. How naive I had been. Now I sat across from my lawyer as we drafted a new will, one as sharp and ironclad as the betrayal that had inspired it. I cut her name from it completely. Not one cent, not one possession, not one thread of my life's work would pass into her greedy hands. My son, though still blinded by her influence, would not be left defenseless, but her control over him would mean nothing in the face of documents sealed by law. We also created clauses she could never undo, stipulations that bypassed her entirely, ensuring the money flowed directly into the trust accounts of my grandchildren. Their futures would be secured without her interference. I pictured them growing up free of her poisonous grasp, free to build lives of their own without the shadow of entitlement looming over them. The thought steadied me, strengthened me. My sacrifices had always been for the next generation, and now I was ensuring they would not be squandered by the greed of one woman. There were other smaller measures too. Joint accounts were dissolved. Investments were shifted. Property titles were restructured in ways that seemed unremarkable to the outside eye, but built an impenetrable wall around my estate. I left nothing to chance. If she ever tried to challenge it, she would be met with a fortress of legal precision that would crush her ambition under its weight. And all the while, I remained silent. At dinners, I listened to her chatter, her thinly veiled jabs about my age, her smug tone when she spoke of the future. She had no idea that every word she spoke was building a noose around her own plans. She smiled at me, perhaps even believing I was fading, slipping into the irrelevance she longed for. But inside, I smiled back, though not for the same reason. I knew something she did not. I knew that the legacy she craved had already slipped from her grasp, placed into hands she could never control. The secret plan was in motion, and there was no undoing it. I had turned my pain into strategy, my silence into strength. One day soon, she would learn the truth. And when that day came, her shock would be as complete as my vindication. The strange thing about arrogance is that it always reveals itself too loudly. My daughter-in-law could have kept her plans hidden, she could have maintained the mask of civility, but her pride would not allow it. In her mind, she had already won, and so she began to speak more freely, letting her confidence spill out in ways that exposed her true nature. I heard the whispers. I caught the sideways glances at family gatherings, and I realized she was bragging about her supposed victory before the battle had even begun. At one dinner, she laughed a little too hard at a joke one of her friends made about forgetful old men. Then, with that same smile she always wore, she turned to me and said, "Don't worry, Father. Soon you won't have to manage anything at all. We'll take care of it." The words were delivered sweetly, as though they were meant to comfort me, but behind them was a blade. My fork trembled slightly in my hand as I forced a polite smile, playing the role of the oblivious elder. Inside, though, I catalogued every word, every smirk, every arrogant display. I overheard her once on the phone, speaking with a relative in a hushed but excited tone. She told them that she would soon have everything under control, that my son wouldn't have to worry about anything once she had sorted out my finances. I caught the way she described me, confused, slipping, too old to know what's happening. Each label she placed on me was meant to strip me of dignity, to paint me as a frail man on the edge of irrelevance. I clenched my fists behind closed doors, but I never let her see my fury. The angrier she believed I could become, the more cautious she might be. And so I remained calm, outwardly oblivious, while inside my resolve deepened. At family events, her arrogance became more obvious. She would sit with her friends or even with distant relatives and let her tongue slip. "It won't be long now," she once said with a sly grin. "Soon, I'll have the finances in order. He won't even notice the difference." They laughed with her, but I noticed the discomfort in some of their eyes. They did not know the full extent of her cruelty, but they sensed the cold ambition behind her words. To them, it might have seemed like idle boasting. To me, it was a confession of intent. She underestimated me so completely that she did not even bother to lower her voice when mocking me. Once, while passing through the hallway, I heard her speaking with one of her friends in the living room. "He still thinks he's in control," she said, chuckling. "It's almost cute. He doesn't realize how far gone he is." The words struck me like a slap, but I kept walking, my face composed, my expression calm. She thought she was belittling me in secret, but what she was really doing was tightening the rope she had thrown around her own neck. Her overconfidence became her greatest weakness. Every time she mocked me, every time she painted me as confused or incompetent, she revealed how blind she truly was to the truth. She could not see the shield I had already built around my estate, nor could she imagine the strength that still lived inside me. She believed she was climbing toward triumph, but in reality, she was building a tower of arrogance so tall that her fall would be catastrophic. And I waited, patient, silent, watching as she bragged and laughed, certain of her victory. Because when the truth finally broke, when she realized the fortress she thought she had stormed was impenetrable, her humiliation would be absolute. The greatest weapon I wielded against her was silence. While she paraded her arrogance like a badge of honor, mocking me in whispers and smirks, I chose to say nothing. I played my part carefully, deliberately. If she thought me weak, I would become weaker, still in her eyes. If she thought me confused, I would allow my silence and feigned forgetfulness to convince her further. Each time I let her believe she was winning, I was in fact tightening the snare that would one day close around her. It was not easy. My pride bristled every time she spoke down to me, every time she slipped those condescending comments into conversations. "You really don't need to worry yourself with these things anymore," she said once as she moved a stack of bills from the table. "We'll handle it." I looked at her with a blank expression, letting my eyes drift slightly as though her words had no weight. Inside, I burned. But outwardly, I let her believe I was fading, that I was stepping aside without even realizing it. I started moving slower around the house, not because my body demanded it, but because I wanted her to see me as frail. I let her think I forgot details, let her correct me in front of others. She laughed once when I deliberately asked a question I already knew the answer to. "See," she whispered to my son when she thought I wasn't listening. "He's slipping." I swallowed the sting of those words, forcing myself to appear unfazed. She did not understand that what she mistook for weakness was strategy. My silence was not surrender, it was preparation. The more she believed me incapable, the bolder she became. I could see it in her eyes, the gleam of someone convinced they were on the verge of total control. She no longer bothered to mask her ambition as carefully as before. She spoke more openly about when she would take over, rather than if. She became careless in her arrogance, certain that no resistance could come from me. There were moments when my son glanced at me, perhaps sensing that something was off. I would catch his eyes as his wife belittled me, and for a brief second I thought I saw hesitation in him, maybe even guilt. But I would quickly look away, feigning weariness. It was important that he too believed my act. If he thought I was fighting, he might warn her. But if he thought I was slipping, if he thought I was too tired to care, then he would remain silent, and her overconfidence would grow unchecked. Late at night, when the house was still, I sat in my chair and replayed her words. I let them cut into me, let them remind me of the battle ahead. Every insult, every dismissal, every arrogant laugh was fuel. My heart beat with a cold fire, not of rage alone, but of certainty. She was walking into a trap she could not see, a trap she was building with her own hands. Foreshadowing has a cruel beauty. She thought she was foreshadowing my decline, telling others that I was too old, too confused, too weak to endure. But the truth was reversed. I was foreshadowing her downfall. Each act of silence, each feigned moment of confusion was another brick in the wall I was building. And when the time came, that wall would stand tall while she crumbled beneath the weight of her own arrogance. I endured, I pretended, and I waited. Because patience, I had learned, is the sharpest blade of all. The day of reckoning came sooner than I expected. I had been waiting patiently, enduring her arrogance, letting her believe she had already won, when word reached me that she intended to return to the bank and press her claim more forcefully. She believed she had gathered enough momentum, enough influence over my son, and enough confidence in her fabricated story to convince the bank she was right. She thought it would be the day she secured control over my accounts. What she did not know was that I had been waiting for this very moment, preparing for it with every ounce of strength I had left. I dressed carefully that morning. My gray shirt was pressed, my slacks neatly ironed, my shoes polished until they gleamed. I wanted no trace of frailty in my appearance. The man who walked into that bank would not look like someone slipping into confusion. He would look like who he had always been, a man of dignity, a man who had built his life through sweat and sacrifice. My lawyer met me outside, his briefcase in hand, his eyes steady with reassurance. Together, we stepped through those glass doors, side by side, ready to face her. She was already there, sitting confidently across from the bank officer, her voice carrying the same false sweetness I had heard before. She spoke of me as though I were a burden, painting pictures of forgetfulness, confusion, and decline. Her words were coated with fake concern, as if she were doing me a favor by taking control. When her eyes lifted and landed on me walking into the room, the color drained from her face. For the first time, I saw her mask falter. I did not raise my voice. I did not storm in with fury. Instead, I entered calmly, pulling out the chair beside my lawyer and sitting down with deliberate composure. My silence filled the room heavier than any shout could have. The bank officer looked at me with surprise, clearly unsettled by the fact that the man being described as incompetent sat before him with a steady gaze and firm presence. My lawyer began to speak, his words sharp and precise, cutting through her lies like a blade. He presented medical documentation affirming my sound state of mind. He laid out legal documents showing the protections already in place, protections she had no knowledge of, protections that made her attempt irrelevant before it even began. Then he asked me to speak for myself. I lifted my head and met the banker's eyes. I am not confused. I am not incapable. I have lived a life of labor, of saving, of building something for my family. And though I may be older, my mind is sharp and my will is intact. The only confusion here is the presumption that anyone else has the right to strip me of what I have earned. My voice was steady, every syllable weighted with years of dignity. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, her confidence slipping as each piece of evidence dismantled her narrative. I watched her face pale further with every word spoken, every paper signed, every truth revealed. She opened her mouth to object, but no sound came. For once, her tongue, so sharp and practiced, had failed her. The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with silence, her silence. And in that silence, I knew the tide had turned. She had come to the bank to declare me powerless, but instead, she left exposed, her lies stripped bare, her arrogance shattered. The air inside the bank's office felt thick, heavy with tension, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. My daughter-in-law sat rigid in her chair, her smile faltering as my lawyer placed a thick folder on the polished desk between us. With calm deliberation, he opened it and began to slide documents across the table, each one a nail hammered into the coffin of her lies. The first was a letter from my physician, signed and dated, certifying my mental clarity and cognitive health. My lawyer read it aloud, his voice steady and precise, the words echoing like iron across the room. No signs of impairment, no evidence of decline. Patient remains fully capable of making financial and personal decisions. With every sentence, I could see the bank officer's eyes shift from skepticism to recognition. The image my daughter-in-law had painted of a confused old man was already crumbling, piece by piece, beneath the weight of professional truth. Next came the financial documents, proof of the careful restructuring of my estate, the trusts, and the accounts placed beyond her reach. My lawyer explained each detail, his words crisp and deliberate, while I sat silently, my presence alone reinforcing every point. These papers did not just speak of wealth. They spoke of strategy, of forethought, of a mind very much aware of its power. The irony was sweet. In trying to paint me as incompetent, she had given me the opportunity to reveal just how capable I truly was. Finally, my lawyer gestured for me to speak. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch for a moment before I began. "I am not the man she claims me to be," I said firmly, my voice steady with conviction. "I have lived a long life, and though I may carry the years in my body, my mind remains clear. Every penny in my accounts was earned through labor, sacrifice, and discipline. To suggest that I am incapable of managing it is not only false, it is an insult to everything I have built." I looked directly at the banker, locking eyes with him so he could see the truth for himself. "Ask me what you wish. Dates, numbers, history. I will answer you with the clarity of a man who has lived it all." The banker hesitated for only a moment before asking a few pointed questions about my accounts, my investments, and even recent transactions. I answered each one without pause, without confusion, my memory sharp, my voice unwavering. The color drained from her face with every answer, her lies unraveling thread by thread. By the end of it, the banker leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and looked squarely at her. "I see no evidence of incapacity here," he said firmly. "On the contrary, everything presented confirms the opposite." His words struck like a verdict, final and undeniable. My lawyer closed the folder with a decisive snap. "This matter," he said, his tone cool and professional, "is settled." She sat there, her mouth slightly open, her hands twisting in her lap. For the first time, she had no words. Her carefully constructed story had collapsed in on itself, leaving her exposed, humiliated, and powerless. The banker nodded toward me with a look of respect, one I had not seen in many years. In that moment, I felt the weight of vindication settle over me. The evidence had spoken louder than her lies, louder than her arrogance. She had tried to strip me of my dignity, but instead, she had handed me the perfect opportunity to prove it still burned brightly within me. There are moments in life when arrogance, once so loud, crumbles into silence. That day at the bank, I watched my daughter-in-law's confidence dissolve before my eyes. The woman who had once laughed at me in hushed tones, who whispered to others that I was too old and too confused, now sat pale and trembling as the truth bore down on her. The banker's words had been simple but devastating. "I see no evidence of incapacity here. On the contrary, Mr. Santos has demonstrated full awareness and control over his affairs." Those words landed like hammer strikes, shattering the foundation of her scheme. The smile she so often wore, the smug, calculated mask, was gone. In its place was a face drained of color, her lips pressed tightly together, as though she might hold back the shame if she only stayed silent. I sat across from her, calm and steady, my lawyer at my side, while the documents and testimony lay scattered across the desk like weapons after a battle. She tried to gather herself, shifting uncomfortably in her seat, but her hands betrayed her, fidgeting nervously in her lap. The banker's gaze, once neutral, now held a quiet edge of disapproval, and even the assistant in the corner looked away, unable to hide their discomfort at having witnessed her deception. Her arrogance collapsed, not with a scream, but with stillness. She had no defense, no clever words to twist, no ground to stand on. Every claim she had made was dismantled by medical certificates, legal protections, and my clear, coherent responses. The woman who once boasted to friends that she would soon control everything now looked like a child caught in a lie, stripped of the grandeur she had cloaked herself in. I will never forget the moment she attempted one final pitiful protest. He doesn't always seem this clear," she stammered, her voice unsteady, her eyes darting between the banker and my lawyer as though searching for someone to believe her. But the banker's firm shake of the head silenced her. "I cannot act on assumptions or accusations," he said coldly. "We deal with evidence, and the evidence speaks for itself. This matter is closed." Those words ended her performance. She slumped slightly in her chair, her shoulders no longer held high, her eyes refusing to meet mine. Around us, the witnesses, bank staff, the lawyer, even the passers-by who caught whispers of the exchange, saw her for what she truly was. Not a protector of family interests, but a manipulator exposed. Her reputation, once carefully managed with charm and deceit, cracked in that office, and no mask could hide the humiliation written plainly across her face. For me, it was not triumph in the sense of victory over an enemy, but vindication. I had endured her arrogance, her condescension, her cruel whispers, and now the world could see the truth. She was not powerful. She was desperate. She was not cunning. She was careless. She was not in control. She had already lost. I rose slowly, deliberately, my every movement a declaration of dignity. As I left the office with my lawyer, I did not look back at her. I did not need to. Her silence was enough. Her humiliation was complete. As we left the banker's office, the heavy silence lingered like smoke after a fire. My daughter-in-law remained seated, pale and trembling, but it was my son's face that caught my attention. For years, he had stood quietly at her side, blinded by her charm, paralyzed by her dominance. He had listened to her mockery of me, swallowed her lies, and chosen silence when his voice could have shielded me. But now, in that stark office where the truth had burned away all illusions, his eyes opened for the first time. I will never forget the look on his face, wide-eyed, disbelieving, caught between anger and shame. He turned to his wife, searching for the confidence she usually wore like armor, but found only a hollow mask crumbling under the weight of exposure. His jaw clenched, his hands tightened at his sides, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of resistance in him, a man awakening from a long slumber of submission. "Is it true?" he asked her quietly, his voice strained. "Did you really come here to declare my father unfit?" She opened her mouth, fumbling for an answer, but no lie would form. Her silence was answer enough, and I saw the betrayal wash over him like a tidal wave. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with something I had not seen in years, respect mingled with guilt. He had believed her whispers, accepted her portrayal of me as weak and fading, and now the truth stood before him, undeniable. His father was not weak. His father was not confused. His father had been fighting, silently, wisely, with a strength he had failed to recognize. The guilt was plain on his face. He looked at me as though the years of silence pressed down on him all at once. I could almost hear the thoughts in his mind. Why didn't I defend him sooner? Why did I allow her words to poison my judgment? Why did I remain silent when he needed me most? His shoulders sagged under the weight of those questions, and for a moment he could not meet my gaze. But when he finally did, I saw something new in his eyes, resolve. Perhaps it came too late. Perhaps it could never erase the hurt of the years gone by, but it was there, nonetheless. He reached out, placing a hesitant hand on my arm, and said in a low, earnest voice, "I'm sorry, Father. I should have seen this. I should have stood by you." It was not easy for me to accept those words. Pain has a way of hardening a man, and I could not ignore the ache of his silence all those years. Yet, in that moment, I also saw my son not as a pawn of his wife, but as a man awakening to the truth. I gave him a nod, not of full forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. He had finally opened his eyes, and for that, I was grateful. As we walked out of the bank together, his steps fell in line with mine, his head bowed in thought. The spell she had cast over him was broken, and though the scars of her manipulation would remain, the bond between father and son had begun to mend. He had witnessed her lies unravel, and in that unraveling, he had rediscovered the strength of the man he once looked up to. And for me, that was victory enough. There comes a moment when silence is no longer enough, when the truth must be spoken plainly, not in anger, but in the clarity of principle. For me, that moment came as I stood before my daughter-in-law, her face pale and drained of the arrogance she once carried so proudly. My son stood beside me, his shame still fresh, his awakening still fragile. The banker had spoken, the lawyer had dismantled her lies, but there was one final thing that needed to be said, not by documents, not by witnesses, but by me. I turned to her, my voice steady, my posture firm. "You thought you could strip me of my dignity, reduce me to a man too weak to defend himself. You saw my years as weakness, my silence as surrender. But let me remind you of something you forgot. Respect cannot be taken, and it cannot be bought. It must be earned, and betrayal has consequences." Her eyes widened, her lips parting as though she might interrupt, but I raised a hand, cutting her off with nothing more than composure. Every penny in my accounts, every stone of the house I built, every small piece of comfort my family enjoys, it came from my labor. My hands bled for it. My back ached for it. My nights were spent working when others slept. I denied myself luxuries so that my son and his family could live with security. And you, instead of honoring that sacrifice, sought to rob it. Not with gratitude, not even with honesty, but with deceit. The silence in the room was heavy, every word I spoke pressing down on her arrogance until it cracked further. She fidgeted, unable to meet my eyes, but I did not let her escape. I am not a fool. I am not a senile old man stumbling toward the grave. I am a man who has lived long enough to know the cost of betrayal, and I will not allow you to profit from it. I let the words sink in before continuing, softer now, but no less sharp. My money is mine to protect, not because I hoard it, not because I value it more than life, but because it represents the sweat of my brow, the nights of sacrifice, the love I poured into this family. You thought it was yours by right, but rights are not inherited through greed. They are given through trust, and you have broken that trust forever. Her shoulders slumped, her mouth opening in a weak attempt at defense, but nothing came. There were no clever words left to twist, no mask to hide behind. My son stood silent beside me, the guilt plain on his face, and even he did not move to shield her. He knew as well as I did that truth had finally spoken. I ended with a final declaration, not loud, not cruel, but calm and final. From this day forward, you will know that I am not yours to manipulate. My legacy is not yours to seize. You have treated me as though I am nothing, but I am a man who has given everything. And now, I choose to live with dignity, not in the shadow of your schemes. Her silence was my answer. The banker's nod was my vindication, and my own calm heart was proof that the storm had finally passed. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, when I stepped out of the bank's glass doors. The light spilled across the sidewalk, warm and golden, and for the first time in what felt like years, I breathed freely. My shoulders, so often heavy with the weight of betrayal and sorrow, felt lighter. My steps were steady, my heart calm. Behind me, the echoes of confrontation still lingered: her pale face, my son's shaken expression, the banker's firm words. But before me stretched the open street, a road unchained from fear. I had walked into that building with the quiet resolve of a man ready for battle, and I walked out with something far greater: vindication. My dignity remained intact, untouched by her lies. My inheritance, the fruits of a lifetime of sacrifice, was secured beyond her reach. The daughter-in-law who once boasted so loudly of her coming triumph now stood disgraced, stripped of the illusions she had woven so carefully. And I, long underestimated, had emerged not as a victim, but as a man who had chosen to protect himself and his legacy. My lawyer walked beside me, a reassuring presence, his words firm as he reminded me that all was now safeguarded. "She cannot touch a cent," he said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "Your accounts, your estate, your trusts, everything is protected. She is finished." I nodded, not with triumph, but with quiet satisfaction. Justice did not always roar. Sometimes it simply arrived like a steady hand on your shoulder, reminding you that you had done what needed to be done. My son followed a few steps behind, his face etched with shame, but also with the faint glimmer of recognition. He had seen his wife's mask shatter, seen her cruelty laid bare, and perhaps for the first time in years, he had also seen me for who I truly was. Not weak, not confused, but strong, resilient, and unwilling to be erased. His silence was heavy, but I knew his heart was wrestling with guilt and awakening. In time, perhaps, bridges could be rebuilt. For now, it was enough that he finally understood. As I paused at the curb, I looked back once more at the bank's doors. I thought of the years I had welcomed her into my family, the kindness I had shown, the debts I had paid, the support I had offered, all turned against me in greed. Yet, even in her betrayal, she had given me something unexpected, the chance to stand tall again. She had tried to strip me of power, and instead, she had reminded me of it. The air was cool, and I inhaled deeply, letting the peace of the moment wash over me. I had secured not just my money, but my dignity. I had proven that age does not mean irrelevance, that silence does not mean weakness, and that betrayal, no matter how cunning, carries its own downfall. I walked forward, no longer burdened by fear of her schemes. My legacy was mine, my peace restored. For the first time in many years, I felt free, not because I had won a war, but because I had chosen to live on my own terms. And that, I realized, was the truest justice of all. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.